Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Lenshofsky. I'm president of the Institute. I'd like to welcome you all here for a most felicitous occasion. For those of you who are new to IWP, we are an independent graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs in statecraft and international affairs, in statecraft and national security. We have the first master's program in strategic intelligence studies outside the U.S. government. We have each of these are 2-year programs, but we also have an 18-month program that was designed for people in the armed forces who can't take any more than 18 months for study. We have an executive master's program for 1 year. We have 17 graduate certificate programs, and we have the nation's first professional doctoral program in national security. Our faculty are mostly scholar practitioners, ambassadors, military officers, intelligence officers, foreign aid officials, people who've done public diplomacy, political warfare, strategic influence, all the different things that are actually done in the world. Our student body are half of them are recent college grads, and the other half are mid-career professionals. And in many agencies of the government send their students here. The armed forces do. The Army sends its colonels here as senior war college fellows in lieu of going to war college. And then just last week, the Navy approved all 5 of our master's programs as satisfying the educational requirements for professional certification in information operations and intelligence. So we are having a lot of fun teaching things that virtually none of the other schools in the region or in the country have taught, and insofar as they do, they are copying us. So anyway, we are particularly interested in all sorts of issues and regions of the world. We have a center here called the Center for Intermarium Studies. Intermarium means the lands between the seas, between the Baltic, the Black, and the Adriatic Seas. And as many of you may know, the presidents of Poland and Croatia not long ago launched the so-called 3 Seas Initiative, which is designed to bring many of the countries in that region into closer connection with one another, whether it be educational, cultural, scientific relations, whether it is electrical grid, transportation, or particularly energy interactions. And we here have actually our own mini 3 Cs initiative because we're trying to recruit students from the many countries in that region who can come here, get to know America better, we can get to know them and their cultural and strategic perspectives better, and then they can get to know each other here in a place that's different than their own home stomping grounds. Insofar as any of you have connections with any of the countries in that region, and I think some of you do, I just wanted you to be aware of this because we think it's in the mutual interests of the United States and the countries of that region to have better contacts and educational exchanges are a very big part of this. The U.S. government made major investments in educational, cultural, and other kinds of exchanges with our new NATO allies in the 1950s in order to build an Atlantic community. We have not done the same kind of thing with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. In the spirit of our interest in this part of the world, It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Jaroslav Martyniuk. He is the author of this new book, Monte Rosa, Memoir of an Accidental Spy. And Yaroslav is a former energy economist with the OECD. He is a sociologist also by profession. The thing that particularly attracted me to his background is the fact that he was a former research analyst for Radio Liberty and its Soviet area audience and opinion research office in Paris during the 1980s, where he was responsible for coordinating the work of 50 Russian-speaking interviewers who would conduct unorthodox public opinion polling with visitors from the Soviet Union. And this was some of the most interesting cultural intelligence work that was being done by anybody associated with the US government, although RFERL were private, independent organizations, but completely government funded. I used to study the results of these interviews very closely myself when I was working in the State Department, in the European Bureau, and then working for Undersecretary Eagleberger, and then in my own capacity working on Soviet affairs in the National Security Council for President Reagan. And I found that we learned all sorts of stuff from this remarkable project in which you were involved that we were not learning from our intelligence services or from our diplomats. And it is actually, there is astonishing information that came out of all of this. And I just was bursting with admiration for the people who were doing this. And so I just wanted to say that to you, Yaroslav, because what you did, I think, was very important. As many of you may recall that the great Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn described our broadcasters, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty, as the most powerful weapons the United States possessed in the Cold War. I believe that he was exactly correct. I think that this was an essential part of our ability, that this research effort in which you were involved was an essential part of our ability to understand the culture, the mentality, the current political and economic and other conditions behind the Iron Curtain, and to be able, therefore, to connect with the peoples of the Soviet Empire in a much more effective way. Scratch your favorite foreign policy expert in Washington and ask that person if they can explain what Solzhenitsyn was talking about, and I don't think that you will get an intellectually satisfying response, because we don't care about public diplomacy, cultural intelligence, strategic influence in this country, and I think that these are instruments of national power that have to be studied much more closely and carefully than they are. Yaroslav speaks 5 languages. During his multiple careers, he's traveled to every country in continental Europe. He's visited all of the republics of the former Soviet Union. As a Ukrainian-born American, his life story includes a narrow escape from communism at the end of World War II, life within post-war Germany, and finally immigration to the United States. It's a great pleasure for me to turn the podium over to you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for such a wonderful introduction. And let me say what a great pleasure it is to be here at the Institute of World Politics, and I feel particularly honored to share this venue with many of the distinguished speakers and scholars who have been here before me. At one of the last lectures I attended at the IWP was a book signing by Admiral John Lehman, formerly Secretary of Navy under Reagan administration. He wrote a book called Oceans Ventured, Winning the Cold War at Sea, where he revealed the role the US Navy played during the Reagan administration in bringing down the quote-unquote evil empire. One of the reasons he gave for writing the book is that nobody else did. And that is precisely the reason why I have chosen to write this Monte Rosa. It is a story of a little-known research unit in Paris called Soviet Area Audience and Opinion Research, and a chapter of Cold War history that has never been told in such lucid detail. I want to begin by telling you that last November I attended a conference sponsored by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation at the Library of Congress. And there were roughly 35 different panels. It was a 3-day conference, 35 different panels, 8 different panels with 35 distinguished scholars and speakers. And if there was a message that one was able to take away from this conference, it was that 100 years of communism have produced 100 million dead. And there is a whole generation of young people who know very little or nothing about this chapter of history. And at the same time, polls taken by Victims of Communism Foundation and Pew Research showed that half of the millennials would like to see socialism in the United States, and 1/5 would actually vote for a communist candidate. Now, before I continue, I'd like to share with you an anecdote that was popular in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Question: what comes after capitalism? Answer: socialism. What comes after socialism?
Alcoholism.
Communism. What comes after communism? Alcoholism. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, socialism, communism, and then finally alcoholism. Okay. So, Monte Rosa consists of 40 essays, vignettes, covering roughly the first 50 years of my life from the outbreak of World War II until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. 2/3 of the narrative takes place in France, where I worked for 12 years, first for the International Energy Agency, and then for Radio Liberty. And 10 chapters of the book describe in detail my undercover research work on behalf of Radio Liberty. However, before I continue, a few biographical facts about me. I graduated from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana Business School in 1963. I entered the U.S. Army Intelligence School at Fort Holabird, where I was trained to analyze military intelligence gathered by the U-2 spy planes. And by chance, I became a specialist in spying from the air. The U-2, by the way, was an amazing aircraft. And after 60 years of service, the plane is still operational. Next, I worked for Amoco Oil for 15 years in Chicago. And in 1979, I had the good fortune to be appointed principal administrator of the oil industry division of the International Energy Agency in Paris, a position that carried with it a diplomatic status. In the mid-1980s, my language skills, because of my language skills, I morphed into what quote-unquote Cold War warrior and became involved in a little-known but crucial side skirmish of the war, a story that has never been told by anyone anywhere. As some of you, I see there are a couple of former Radio Liberty people here, Radio Liberty's broadcasts undermined the Soviet Union from within, a process that was not unlike the slow, steady tunneling to bring down a seemingly impenetrable fortress. And from these vantage points, I was able to observe the empire's dying years, and fate placed me in a position to contribute in a small way. Why Monte Rosa, you might ask? I answered this question in the first chapter my first chapter of the memoir, where I described two events that took place in the middle of August of 1991. Events that had a profound effect on my life. During the week I was climbing Switzerland's highest peak, the Soviet Union imploded. I call it my Monte Rosa moment, and I describe it as a confluence of events that lifted my body and my spirit to new heights, literally and metaphorically. And only a few days later, another landmark event took place on August 24th, 1991. The Ukrainian Rada proclaimed independence, in effect signing USSR's death warrant. The memoir touches on a variety of subjects, too many to list here. It includes an autobiographical account of my family, the fate of my extended family in the Soviet gulags of Vorkuta and Kolyma, both death camps above the Arctic Circle. It's also a European travelogue and contains reflections on history, politics, economics, art, religion, and the significance of freedom and the phenomena of synchronicity. Since I cannot summarize the 400-page book in the time allowed, I'll focus on two aspects which I think will be of special interest to this audience. First, I want to tell you how a small unit of Radio Liberty called SAAOR in Paris carried out research with Soviet citizens in the West using highly unorthodox interviewing methodology that today is referred to as the undercover social science. This is the subject of 10 chapters of the book. And second, I'll tell you how my work, first in the International Energy Agency and then Radio Liberty in Paris, provided me with unique insights that helped me to explain the real reasons for the downfall of the evil empire. 2 chapters of the memoir, What Killed the Soviet Empire, and unique revelations and insights expand on this theme. Many books have been written about the role of Radio Liberty and other Western broadcasters in penetrating the Iron Curtain with information. However, no one told the story of how our Paris-based unit carried out undercover interviewing, that is, finding and interviewing Soviet citizens temporarily in Western Europe. It was human intelligence, I like what John's expression, cultural intelligence gathering effort aimed at uncovering the reality of life of ordinary citizens in the Soviet Union. The majority of so-called experts did not believe that such an exercise was possible, and that's why none of them even attempted it. But contrary to conventional wisdom, during the 1980s, thousands of Soviet citizens, for one reason or another, traveled to Western Europe. They included diplomats, entertainers, sailors, businessmen, but the vast majority of visitors we interviewed came on cruise ships that originated in Leningrad and Odessa. And on the northern end of the stream, when they came from Leningrad, which is off the map, they took a tour of the Baltic Sea, and the destination was Copenhagen, where we had 12 interviewers ready to intercept and talk to these people. On the southern front, the cruise ships left in Odessa, went through the Baltic, Dardanelles, Bosphorus, Dardanelles, went around the Greek island Cyclades, and ended up in Piraeus near Athens. There we had 10 Russian-speaking interviewers. And by the way, interesting sideline, the Greek interviewers were Russian speakers because they lived in Uzbekistan most of their lives and were allowed to leave after the Helsinki Accords. And so we had native Russian speakers working in Athens, and this was an absolutely fascinating interviewing point. And 2 or 3 chapters of the book go into a lot of details, which I don't have time to go right now. So, overall, there were 12 interviewing points in Europe from Helsinki down to Athens. And the interviewing points included Hamburg, Berlin, Paris, London, Vienna, Rome, and Athens, the port of Piraeus, Athens, where the tourists came out by the thousands, literally by the thousands. So it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The size of the operation was huge. On average, we conducted 5,000 interviews a year. And over the years, we accumulated a database of 50,000 interviews. My former boss, Gene Parta, came out with a book called The Hidden Listener, where he presents the results of all our findings. And I think Irina knows Gene Parta very well. All of the interviewers were native Russian speakers trained to find and engage unsuspecting Soviet citizens and extract information on various topics of interest to Radio Liberty management in Munich and agencies in Washington. In addition to estimating the size of the audiences to Western radios, we polled Soviet citizens about the attitudes on such delicate issues as the war in Afghanistan, the Chernobyl catastrophe, perestroika, and myriad of other issues. In brief, we were conducting polling without the respondent knowing that he or she was being interviewed. And I explained this in the chapter called Modus Operandi in a very detailed fashion. The information we gathered was passed to management in Radio Liberty in Munich, as I said, and decision makers at the highest level of U.S. government, including the State Department, Pentagon, and the CIA. The reports allow them to better understand what the people inside the Soviet Union were actually thinking. In this respect, our work differed from conventional analyses by the so-called experts, an array of Sovietologists, Kremlin watchers, academic sages, who tried to discern hidden between-the-line messages from scrutinizing Soviet newspapers, Izvestia and Pravda. Now let me switch to the second theme of my presentation. What killed the Soviet Empire? The causes behind the Soviet Union's disintegration were many and complex. And many of you probably know what they are. There were, however, a number of reasons most historians, academics, either ignored or overlooked. So first, just to give you a brief overview of what we know. To begin with, the Soviet system had a built-in structural defect. It depended on an inherently dysfunctional model tied to an unworkable utopian ideology. Years of communist rule had choked the economy, stifled inflation, destroyed initiative, created mind-boggling inefficiencies and corruption at all levels. And the Soviet Empire was dying under the weight of its status, economic yoke, and contradictions, and the system was crumbling from within. When the Soviet elites led by Gorbachev realized the extent of the problems, they turned to the West for solutions. He introduced glasnost, perestroika, uskorenie perestroika, which translates roughly into openness, acceleration, and rebuilding. However, Gorbachev actually did the right things, but for the wrong reasons. But because his overriding aim was to save communism in the Soviet Union. His staggering miscalculation eventually culminated in the death of the Soviet Union. I'll just go over very quickly some of the events preceding the collapse, which most of you are familiar with. And it all began with the industrial unrest in Poland in 1980. At the same time, Karol Wojtyla was elected, became Pope John II, and his prestige and inspirational message, "Be not afraid," lifted the spirits of not only the Polish people, but the entire Eastern Bloc. However, the event that mortally wounded the empire was the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. After 2 years, the Soviets realized that the war is unwinnable, and they did not know how to extricate themselves without losing face. Afghanistan, as we all know, was a cemetery of empires and eventually became Soviet Army's graveyard. After losing the war in Afghanistan, forced the Soviets to abandon their outer empire, and their disastrous military campaign made them reluctant to send troops anywhere else. And without the implied threat of force, they were unable to hold on to the Eastern European satellites. Today, it's very clear that the loss of these satellites led to the crumbling of the wall and lifting of the Iron Curtain, a development that eventually provoked the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And finally, one cannot dismiss the impact of President Reagan's powerful speech when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, as well as his memorable words at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate on June 12, 1987. With Gorbachev present, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So that's a prelude to a summary of what is generally accepted and known. Now I'll turn to several factors which were either ignored or overlooked or simply not known, not considered in this. And I reduced them to three. First of all, the role of nationalism in the USSR. Second, the broadcast of radio liberty. And third, the gyrations in the world price of crude oil in the 70s and 1980s. The last one is the least known and least analyzed. I'll now cover that in detail. I should like to underscore that hardly any of the mainstream experts took consideration of these three factors to explain the breakup of the Soviet Union. And from my vantage point at the SAAOR, I became convinced that the defects of the empire were so grave, the internal contradictions so numerous, that it was only a matter of time before the whole rotten structure collapsed. That time came in 1991. The empire expired of what I would call a classic case of assisted suicide. So now I'll turn to the nationalities question. The nationalities questions in the Soviet Union has been ignored by many experts and historians for many years before and after the fall of the Soviet Union. With only very few exceptions, they believed that the Soviet Union had once and for all solved the nationalities problem and visualized the USSR as a large, happy family of nations. We at the SAAOR were studying nationalities issue as early as 1983, and our research showed that the Soviet Union was not at all a happy family of nations. And as some academics sympathetic to the Soviet Union believe, and that the nationalities problem in the Soviet Union was real and critical. Our research showed that the problem was aggravated by Russian chauvinism. And the chapter is Insights, Revelations and Insights. I cite a quote from our research that we had actually come up with. There's quotes of our respondents. So, and feedback on this issue was remarkably consistent, whether it was in Copenhagen or Paris or Vienna or Athens. But the academic community in the West was convinced that the march towards socialism would one day render nations obsolete. I'm just curious how many of you think this has a familiar ring today. In reality, the first scholar to have addressed the nationalities issue in a comprehensive way was Harvard's historian Serhiy Plokhy in his seminal 2014 book, The Last Empire, where he documented how differences between Ukrainians and Russians created an obstacle to preserving the Union and the main reason for the disintegration of the USSR. I highly recommend this book. How am I doing? Okay. Mainstream conventional wisdom maintained that differences between nationalities had been replaced by a new identity of the Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man. We at the SAAOR, based on thousands of interviews with Soviet citizens, discovered that the notion of Homo Sovieticus was a phantom. Now, the second point I want to address is the role of radio liberty. One of the major foreign broadcasters to the Soviet Union, the Soviets feared the most, was Radio Svoboda, Radio Liberty. The station broadcast in dozens of languages and addressed issues relevant to individual republics and their languages. Their broadcasts were particularly important in influencing attitudes and opinions to crises such as the war in Afghanistan, the Chernobyl nuclear power disaster in 1986. This was yet another case where the majority of experts came up short. A review of literature on this subject shows that hardly any of them even mentioned the role of Western broadcasters in general and Radio Liberty in particular. Western radios fought the tyrannical communist regimes with truth, the best form of propaganda. Also like to mention in passing the role of a CIA-funded program called an extremely successful publishing and book distribution operation of sending Ukrainian and Polish small format books to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. The organization in New York was called Prolog, and in Paris it was the Institut Literacki, organizations that published two influential magazines in Polish and Ukrainian. In 1985, I was personally involved in smuggling books and video cassette players across the Iron Curtain on behalf of Prolog director, the late Roman Kupczynski, an experience I described in a chapter called Mission to Warsaw. Finally, a rarely mentioned factor that contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union was the drastic price of crude oil in the 1980s. The reason I was able to see the implications of this was because during the first half of 1980s, I worked for the International Energy Agency, where my main responsibility was to keep track of worldwide crude oil prices and supply, including the Soviet Union. And one of the chapters describes how I managed to get detailed information about Soviet production. As in Russia today, oil was the lifeblood of the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union depended on oil revenue to subsidize wheat imports and to feed its population. It's not an exaggeration to say that the revenue from oil sales kept the communist, quote-unquote, beast alive until the 1980s. By mid-decade, when Saudi Arabia flooded the crude oil prices, the price of crude oil had dropped from $40 a barrel to $10 a barrel, and plummeting oil prices deprived the Soviet Union of oil revenue, its life support system. Only a few experts in the West were able to grasp the meaning of this development, probably because they were unaware to the extent to which the Soviet's economy relied on revenue for its survivals. They assumed that because the USSR had muddled through 60 years, it would survive another 60. There was a consensus that the Soviet Union was too big to fail, and a collapse was therefore unimaginable. So just to summarize a very complex history, the drop of crude oil prices followed by a decline in production created conditions that made the Soviet Union unable to subsidize cheap energy to Eastern Europe. This led to a loss of control of the satellites and culminated in the fall of the wall in 1989. The disappearance of the Iron Curtain led to the collapse of the entire Soviet Eastern European Empire and a prelude to the disintegration of a failing nuclear power. No amount of glasnost and perestroika could have prevented its inevitable demise. Now, just in conclusion, while I was working in Munich in 1993, at a time Irina Chalupa remembers very well. I don't know if you attended this meeting, but I had the good fortune to hear Robert Conquest address an audience of RFERL Research Institute analysts and journalists. Conquest was one of the few specialists who went against the grain, questioning the views of establishment academics and experts. In particular, he criticized Western intellectuals for blindness regarding the Soviet Union and argued that Stalinism was a logical consequence of Marxist-Leninism rather than an aberration from true communism. For his views, he was vilified by the progressive left. After opening up of the Soviet archives in 1991, detailed information was released. Supporting conquest conclusions and view on history, he was one of the few historians who lived long enough to see his vision and life's work vindicated by history. Maybe some of you know, Concluso was also a poet known for his witty limericks about communism. And one of my favorites was A Compact History of Soviet Union, which resonates as follows. There was once a great Marxist called Lenin, who did 2 or 3 million men in. That's a lot to have done in. But where he did 1 in, that great Marxist Stalin did 10 in. Conquest lecture was followed by the usual question and answer session where I was able to ask, what would you like to tell people like Jerry Howe and his ilk who got the Soviet Union wrong? He had a ready response. I told you so, you effing fools. Thank you. I'm ready to take questions. Let's see if I can answer them.
What would you attribute the, seems to be a wave of nostalgia for the Soviet Union that is occurring over the last, and it's progressing within the last 20 years. It started off very slow, and now it's to the point that it's supportive of actions that are not unlike what was taking place in the Soviet Union.
Well, the Soviet Union over the years has changed, and there was a re-education going on. It started with, Putin's famous words that the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that was translated into textbooks and instruction manual. Media made a lot of it, and then, of course, people saw the disparity of the wealth of the oligarchs and the poor people in the countryside, and during the Soviet ways, it was more, in a way, more equitable, even though it didn't work. But I think most of the people that yearn for those days are older people who are not in touch with reality. I don't think the younger population is yearning for the Soviet days. You don't know?
The people that you spoke to during those interviews, they were, after all, elites to some extent. They weren't the regular Joe Schmoes. Not everybody got to go on a cruise out of the Soviet Union. They had to be carefully vetted, and I'm sure that they had KGB minders no matter where they went. So how did you get past them, and then how were you able to use the data that they gave you to sort of expand it and to see in their responses, the responses of the regular people that never got to go on cruises to Copenhagen?
Well, first of all, this is conventional wisdom that only the elites got to travel. Communist Party. Actually, that was true in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, it all started to change, and the system introduced a way of rewarding what's known as zasluzheny, the deserved workers who behaved and did a good job, and they were rewarded with this by cruise ships. And like I said, the bulk of our interviewers were with these ordinary people, and on top of it, it was not only from Moscow or Russia oriented. You had Ukrainians, Caucasians, the Balts, Central Asians were all allowed to come out. Now, as soon as these people stepped off the boat, there was always a minder, a KGB escort who said, "Be careful, there are CIA agents out there who are going to try to make you work for them, you know, the story." And the people said, yes, we understand. I witnessed this myself. As soon as they got past the gate, our people approached them with all kinds of innocent questions, and they were, especially if they're, because they were speaking Russian, they opened up their hearts and minds to every question that was open. It was so easy to persuade them to participate in an interview by simply offering them a glass of wine, inviting them for coffee, because they only had pennies. Or in the chapter in my Copenhagen work, they all steered to these cheap shops where they could buy electronics, jeans, with the little pennies that they had. And our people were already there, ready to offer help and say something, you know. For example, you know, Sony is a good station, but a good radio, but it's expensive. If you buy a Sharp, it's less expensive. Oh, really? And they engaged them in a conversation. And it was, they had a lot of experience, and, you know, this was a result of long trial and error, how to engage them, make them feel at ease. And you never start the interview with a question like, what Western radio do you listen to? You know, and the chapter of Modus Operandi has a list of 12 different points, what to do and what not to do. Did I answer all of those parts of your question? Yes.
What role did the Russian church have in the establishment, maintenance, and collapse of the Soviet Union?
As far as I know, the Russian church was part, you know, of the system. They were, you know, KGB operatives, and maybe there was a number of some believers, you know, but before, during the Soviet times, they were not a factor. It's only after the fall that, you know, the Russian Orthodox Church was resurrected, and they're very active today in Russian imperialistic policy, like we see today. Just anybody else? Yaro?
You didn't mention VOA, but I worked with VOA in the 80s, and we also did things like that. But anyway, the question is, how do you see the things developing this weekend?
Oh,
With the talks going on ahead.
You're
Monday, Tuesday talks.
You're asking me to enter the realm of prophecy, and I'm not a Nostradamus, I can tell you. But your original first question, you didn't mention VOA. I said Western broadcasters, and this included VOA, BBC, Radio Israel, Radio Canada, International Canada, Radio Vatican. Yes, the VOA was an important station, but they were seen as a propaganda station, a voice of the United States, and they took them as such, and that's why the Soviets rarely jammed Voice of America like they did VOA. Throughout most of the Cold War, Radio Liberty was heavily jammed, but still people managed to listen through manipulating on the short waves, leaving the cities, and a lot of the information did get through. And that's the distinction between the two. We did a lot of research on the perception of VOA, BBC, and other stations. Yes.
What would you suggest in terms of resurrecting or more focus on public diplomacy with the demise in 2000 of the USIA, thank you, with USIA, and then the shifting of VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I know that right now, Current Time TV is brand new. It's like a year old, and they are broadcasting in Russian and other languages to former Soviet areas, specifically to counter RT TV and the disinformation that's coming out of that. But what would you see that could be much more proactive since we really
No, I agree.
no longer have
I agree. I think organizations like RFERL, VOA have a history of success in penetrating, getting the message to the Soviet people, and they could do it again. But today there are different problems. I'll give you an example. None of the major broadcasters is being rebroadcast. I'm talking about radio. Voice of America had a very good television program in Russia. This is already like 15 years ago. Well, one day the Moscow Bureau got a letter that there's going to be a tax inspection, and that was the end of Voice of America television programming. Radio Liberty also, they were persona non grata, and they stopped. BBC had a similar experience. They simply closed down the operation. So there is no way to transmit the message other than through the internet, and even there it's being controlled. Yes, John.
Yaroslav, I remember reading some extraordinary facts in the product of your research. I'll give you one or two examples. In one case, it was the testimony of somebody who had been working on underground industrial facilities that had the capability of assembling nuclear missiles and putting warheads on them, tunneling them underground to an underground silo where they would be in a position to launch, where the ground above the silo was completely undisturbed. There was no digging, everything was tunneled from underneath, and there was allegedly a nuclear missile silo at the end of a long tunnel after this industrial assembly point. And so if it had to be launched, it would simply pop the cork, so to speak, with maybe 3 feet of soil above the silo.
Oh my goodness.
And now this was one of the testimonies that came out of your team's research. My question is, did you do anything to verify these types of allegations that were made by some of your interviewees? There were other ones. There was a one where somebody was coming to testify about the medical conditions in Soviet hospitals and how the average amount of food you got in such a hospital was about 50 cents worth per day. But that was the official amount.
Yes.
But the actual amount was less than that because the cooks in the Soviet hospitals were the poorest paid cooks in the whole country, and they stole the food out of a sense of justice to be recompensed for their work. So the patients in the hospitals had to depend upon family and friends to get the food, and so the food was being stored in the hospital rooms in an unsanitary way, and this was why there were rats and vermin and all sorts of things that were making these hospitals extremely unhygienic. Anyway, there are all sorts of these types of facts, and I'm wondering, did you ever work on verification of some of this stuff?
Unfortunately, no. Our mission was to collect this cultural human intelligence and pass it on to other people.
Okay.
And we know that a lot of this information did get through to the right people. For example, the Pentagon, there's a memoir written by, I forget the name, that how they used our information about such things as food availability and prices. We collected information about these things throughout the years, and this gave us the best picture of how bad things were. You know, the quotes that I have, I can read you a couple of quotes, but I don't think I have the time right now. You know, that the availability of meat in the Soviet Union was almost non-existent. The best cuts went to the elites, and then the people that worked in these factories, in these packing houses. What got to the stores was bones and fat, if you can find it. Then, for another example that comes to mind is that the butter, there was a shortage of butter, and they were buying butter in vast quantities from Finland. The butter that came in, the best parts of the butter also went to the elites. The rest was diluted with oil and margarine that literally stank, and people had to use this because there was nothing else. Sausages contained, they estimate, 15% meat, and the other rest was filler. This is the kind of information we passed on to all these people. Whether they were able to verify these things, the only verification we were able to get is feedback on the audience, on the quality of radio signals in the Soviet Union. We had people over there that either confirmed or questioned what we were reporting as. Quality of radio signal was extremely important. And our engineers in Munich and in Spain, where the transmitters were, adjusted the transmission signals in a way that to maximize, to improve the radio signals. That was the only kind of verification that we were able to carry out. Yes.
Yeah, as an energy economist during your years at the International Energy Agency, Jerry, what oil market, oil economics factors, mechanisms, and projections indicated to you the progressively weakening base underpinning the Soviet Union?
Well, I actually have a little section in a memoir where the only people that had an idea of the status of the Soviet oil industries were folks at the CIA. And how they managed to get the information, I never asked. But one of the things that they were very certain of, that the Soviets were using very primitive recovery techniques. Almost all of their production was of the kind we call primary recovery. That is, you drill a well and whatever comes out in the beginning, it comes out under its own pressure. But that generally, primary recovery extracts only 10 to 15% of a potential reservoir. After and this was done on a massive scale because they didn't have the secondary recovery techniques that oil companies in the West, which was pumping gas and water into the reservoir to build up the pressure to extract more. And even with secondary recovery techniques, you still had half the reservoir. This is the 70s. And because I worked for the oil company, I was familiar. Tertiary recovery techniques actually involved setting fires underneath in the reservoir to gather all the remaining oil and pump it out. This was in the 70s. Today, they have techniques that are unbelievable. They have, sideways drilling, incredible underground photography, seismological data that we didn't even dream of. And thank you for this. Don worked with me at the International Energy Agency in Paris. We just had a reunion a couple of weeks ago. That was a super affair. Thank you, Dan. Anybody else?
I have a follow-up. if I may.
Yes, please.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about how the quality of the data that you were able to get changed when the Soviet Union fell apart? You know, on the one hand, when you were doing these interviews in all these ports and cities, there was a certain element of skullduggery, it was romantic, but when the Soviet Union fell apart, you got to travel to these countries.
Yes.
You got to do focus groups, you got to do
Surveys.
open polling the way it was done in the West. And how was the quality of information different?
I'm glad you asked that question.
And then
Gene-
how was it used?
Gene Parto describes this very easily. We used, in the Soviet days, we used modeling. That was called Bayesian modeling, developed by MIT. And it compensated for demographics of people that were not there. For example, most of the interviews were done with males, and we tried to have a gender balance. And so what was acceptable to us was 70% male, 30% female, and we told interviewers, go and talk to women. When the borders opened up and we were able to do in-country research, we compared the numbers we had in the Soviet days with the new numbers, and amazingly, Gene Parto writes about this in his book, The Hidden Listener, they dovetailed. There was continuity, and it validated all our research from the 80s that we were doing something right. Grace?
First of all, thank you for this fascinating talk and for this wonderful book. I really recommend it to anybody. It's a great book. Now, as I understand it, Radio Liberty focused on reaching the ordinary people, and that's how you got to them through the interviewing them coming off the boats. On the other hand, the beginning of your talk, you said that what brought down the Soviet Union was mainly internal crumbling, that it was an internal disaster that couldn't be sustained. A great part of my career has been dealing with think tanks and academics in the international field who only focus on the elites. But maybe they're justified, because it seems to me from what you say, the ordinary people didn't really bring down the Soviet Union. It was a matter of the elites. So I have a hard time persuading my colleagues that the ordinary people matter when you have dictators at such an authoritarian regime.
Well, I think as I explained, the movement, let's say in Poland, was by ordinary people.
Mhm.
The nationalities question had nothing to do with elites. It's the way the people felt. And that reached a groundswell and gave impetus to, they were, especially after Chernobyl, the average Soviet citizen stopped believing in what the Soviet media was telling them. Because as you all know, the accident that happened on April 26th, Soviet press didn't mention that. In fact, they said these are these exaggerated stories of the West. People listened to the radio, Voice of America, Radio Liberty, etc. And what happened on May 1st is that people in Kyiv, there was a military parade, a May Day 1st parade. But the people realized that the elites, verkhushka as they say, were sending their kids to Crimea, okay? And that's when finally people put two and two together. So this is a one big lie. And the whole thing started with ordinary citizens ceasing to believe in the Soviet line.
May I just add
Yes.
that we shouldn't forget that the coal miners went on strike in the Donbass and the Kuzbass, and eventually 1 million people took to the streets in Moscow. That was not the nomenclatura. You had huge demonstrations in Vilnius, in Tashkent, in Tbilisi. Gorbachev deployed poison gas and used it against the demonstrators in Tbilisi. And these people were slaughtered by the Spetsnaz troops with sharpened military shovels. There was all kinds of activity of ordinary people.
So it makes me wonder, for instance, in your own faculty, how many sociologists and anthropologists that deal with the local people do you have on your permanent faculty? I taught for 30 plus years at SAIS, and there were zero. There were a lot of economists. There was nobody teaching about what happens at the grassroots level. And I'm sure that's true of the Columbia program, Harvard program.
We have somebody exactly who does that.
Good.
And he works on hearts and minds operations, aid operations. He has his own NGO that works on trying to give assistance to the poverty-stricken Muslim communities in the southern Philippines. He brings them education aid, agricultural aid, medical aid. The key to it all is good cultural intelligence, cross-cultural knowledge, development of long-range relationships of trust over time, and there are very few people in this business, but
I know well.
He teaches this stuff, and he is a practitioner in the field as well. His name is Al Santoli, and magnificent. He is the heir to a lot of the work of General Edward Lansdale and Rufus Phillips, who was with USAID and perhaps other three-letter agencies, for all I know. Anyway, doing that kind of work. So,
If you will permit me, I just want to read you a page from the book, just to illustrate that the book is not only about the Soviet Union, it has a lot of other things. When I moved to Paris, I became a member of the Ukrainian diaspora, and the offices, there was a Ukrainian church with the square Taras Shevchenko, where a lot of the Ukrainians gathered, and after church on Sundays, we would go to a place called Café Bonaparte. And some people who didn't go to church called it Saint Bonaparte's. Anyway, so, and we had amazing people coming over there to show up, artists, dissidents, intellectuals. Many, and I described this. But I want to read to you, take the liberty of reading a short chapter about a section here. Many Parisians consider Place Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is where the Ukrainian church was, and the Café Bonaparte, to be the center not only of Paris, but of Europe, and by extension, the world. It had been the epicenter of intellectual life since the days when Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus frequented Le Demago and Café Fleur. After decades of patronizing the Café Bonaparte, I discovered a fascinating factoid. Jean-Paul Sartre lived with his mother in one of the apartments above Café Bonaparte, a small third-floor residence overlooking the square, until he died on April 15, 1980. Sartre's death was a momentous event. The mood in Paris was somber. Parisians deep in mourning at the passing of their revered intellectual. I'm going to skip this to get to the point quickly. Sartre was a communist sympathizer and once famously said, "Every anti-communist is a dog." He was a fraud who took a whole generation of French philosophy students, intellectuals, and snout for a ride. In 1947, he learned that the slave labor camps existed in the Soviet Union. He promptly declared that Soviet government should not be condemned for this because Soviet government in principle is against slave labor. This fuzzy ball of fur, as historian Paul Johnson painted him, was responsible for giving credibility to one of the most sadistic systems in the history of mankind. He was living proof that the maxim that most of the true believers in communism were intellectuals living in the West, while east of the Iron Curtain hardly anyone believed. And yet, the French had shed a sea of tears over the death of their genius, evocative of masses mourning over Stalin in 1953. Karl Marx claimed that religion is the opium of the people. But in one of the great works of the 20th century political reflection, another French philosopher, Raymond Aron, cleverly modified this aphorism by observing Marxism is the opium of the intellectuals. Thank you.